This podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp. After experiencing trauma, I went to therapy, and my therapist guided me through a difficult time in my life. They helped me understand what was happening and provided me with tools to cope and find my own strength and resilience. Their experience and compassion were invaluable and enabled me to rebuild my life and move forward. I strongly believe in the power of therapy to help people through difficult times. BetterHelp connects you with a licensed therapist who is trained to listen and give you helpful, unbiased advice. First, you go to their site. You can use my link, betterhelp.com/resilience. You answer a few questions, and BetterHelp will match you to a professional who has years of experience helping people with struggles just like yours. Let BetterHelp connect you to a therapist who can support you, all from the comfort of your own home. Visit betterhelp.com/resilience or choose podcast, then Notes on Resilience during sign up and enjoy a special discount on your first month. Hello, welcome to Notes on Resilience. I'm your host, Manya Chilinsky. My guest today is Siddharth Shah. He's a physician, public health scientist, and an educator. And he supports organizations to become trauma responsive by blending organizational dynamics, cross-cultural awareness, mindfulness, and integrative medicine. He's the CEO of Greenleaf Integrative, a growing private sector consulting firm that he founded 15 years ago to assist helpers, healers, and protectors. We had an amazing conversation. We talked about the shadow side of resilience, and resilience not as a trait that we have, but as skills and competencies that we are continuously working on, and resilience as a bridge. This was an amazing conversation, and I hope you enjoy it just as much as I did. Hi, Siddharth. I'm so glad you're here with me today. Thanks for being here.
Manya, hello.
So before we get into talking about who you are and how it is that you and I are talking today, I'd love to know, if you could have a superpower, what would that be?
The superpower I would want is to be artful. I'm in awe of how others have this superpower. If you ask me to draw a cow, you're going to get something that looks like a horse. You ask me to draw a horse, you're going to get a cow. I just don't have the interconnections, the neuronal pathways to render what is in my mind and heart. And so if I had more of the superpower, I'd render my mind and heart into song, or I would sculpt, paint something that moves people, shoot a film that grows empathy and stimulates people into action. I'd want to capture just the right photo, and a photo that is telling. Mm-hmm. I truly have seen throughout my life that to be artful is to enhance our way of seeing. Mm-hmm. And it transmits to others something sublime or mysterious.
Oh, wow. I love that. I love that. All right. If I had a magic wand, I would absolutely give you that power.
I'm taking it all in right now.
Oh, well, thank you for sharing that. And now I'd love to find out, who are you and what do you do, and why are you and I talking about resiliency today?
Right. So the why, I think, my life has led me. It's been in great part a quest for ethical action in the world. I was born in Texas. My parents came from India and chose Houston as home, thanks to this nation's call for engineers to migrate here in the late 60s. Mm-hmm. I was drawn at an early age to helpers, healers, and protectors, mm-hmm. people who give of themselves for the benefit of others. I wanted to be close, collaborate. I was too young to necessarily contribute, I think, but I wanted to be close to those who dedicate their lives to action, ethical action. Mm-hmm. So at different times, I volunteered at the Veterans Administration Hospital, the United Way Center for Kids with Intellectual and Developmental Disability, mm-hmm. Homeless services organizations, Casa Juan Diego for refugee and immigrant care. I don't want to give the impression that I was working as tirelessly as any of those professionals. It was enough for me sometimes to just hang out in the break room and talk to anyone who was around. Mm-hmm. In college, I gravitated toward post-colonial critique, religious studies, and philosophy.
Wow.
And what didn't change in college is continuing to volunteer or to coordinate programs for others to volunteer.
Mhm.
And I still look back and I see the faces of the shelter staff, the orphanage, the paramedics, the caseworkers, and they're my heroes. Even today, I'm the same person who finds himself nourished and changed by the people who run toward disease, poverty, and hurt.
Mhm.
And this all led to perhaps the most formative experience for me that leads to what I'm doing these days in my
Okay.
life. Before I started medical school in 1994, I took a year-long trip to India. Now, I'd always been to India on family vacation.
Okay.
And usually in the summertime, we would take shelter under the fan from noon to 5 and play cards, take naps, and then just have a good time. It was though a little cloistered. I didn't know all of the different societal experiences,
Mhm.
oppression, and also joy and mirth through other people. So what happened in 1994 is I wrote a bunch of snail mail letters. I was really inspired by reading a couple of books and some magazines on work that was being done in India right now, like not historical work back in the
Right.
30s and the 40s. It's like, this is work. A journalist from the New York Times had written this entire book called Averting the Apocalypse.
Mhm.
And in it, he had small vignettes of the people of social movements in India. That to me was a siren call. I said, I gotta go meet these people. So
Oh,
I wrote
wow.
these snail mail letters, a little over 30 letters. I got 3 responses back from organizations that said, come see our work. So I started in the city of Chennai with the Working Women's Forum, which is a microcredit finance organization for women.
Okay.
And I just soaked it all up. And it had some similarities to what I would be doing in Houston, Texas, but then some really notable differences that impacted me.
Mhm.
Within the second or third day of being there in this year-long trip, when they learned that I was staying in a hostel, the Woodlands hostel somewhere, they were a little surprised. They said, I thought you were staying with family. I said, no, I don't have any family in this city. They said, well, then we have people for you to stay with. So all of a sudden, that began this whole pattern of living with the staff and volunteers of these organizations that did something in the world.
Oh, wow.
And in those intimate and domestic environments with the people who do this work, I had these encounters that actually repeated themselves over and over again. One was that their work doesn't end when they leave the office or the
Mhm.
field. Everybody knows where these individuals live, and they are relied upon when there's a tragedy or a crisis. So people show up 10 p.m., 3 a.m. in the morning because something horrific has happened, and they come to the organization staff for help.
Wow.
And I thought to myself, that has it has a toll, as well as it giving them a purpose. And I'm loving what they're doing. I saw it over and over again. And the second one was that for people that I was working with who are doing justice related work,
Mhm.
civil rights, human rights, it's just part of their job, tragically, to get death threats. And so there were
Ooh.
many times that I was there in somebody's living room, and the person I was staying with would pick up the phone and their face would go blank, and they would calmly hang up. And then in my asking them, they would say, well, that was just the third call this week, because they are aligned against forces that want them to fail.
Right.
And I think about how that still applies in today's age, that people get death threats. It may not be from somebody who is going to follow through, but that has an impact on a person's nervous system.
Absolutely. I can't imagine that it wouldn't.
Precisely. And so my sense of empathy and compassion grew from seeing that again and again, seeing it's such a predictable pattern in the lives of people who are helpers, healers, and protectors. And the final experience that I had was that there would always be stories at different organizations. I zigzagged the country. I spent time with about 50 or 60 different efforts or organizations,
Okay.
living with them at times and other times visiting their offices. And the third experience I had was that they would give stories of how, for example, well, You remember Farida? Farida had a very special way of interacting with the community. Or Vivek, he was very good in the organization, but they're not with us anymore. And the constant theme there was that some people only do this work for so long.
Okay.
And then they leave the work. And I thought to myself, I don't want to lose people who do good work in this sector or
Yes.
this space. Hey, we need as many of these individuals as possible, and we need their families supporting them. But if they are being affected by trauma, it's understandable that
Right.
people would leave and need protection and shelter elsewhere.
Right. Wow. What an amazing experience that must have been. I'm some point want to talk to you and learn even more about some of these travels. That sounds fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. So what do you think about the word resilience?
So some of what I believe about resilience definitely comes from living in New York City during the 9/11 attacks,
Mm-hmm.
my response to it, and just really noticing how people relate to trauma and resilience. So with resilience, the word, I come to it with the desire to prevent and mitigate trauma somehow.
Mm-hmm.
And so let me start, if I could, with what I find wrong with the use of the word resilience.
Please do. Yes.
Resilience is problematic in many of its usages. And so I'm really careful to keep up with the scientific literature and popular media outlets, people's reactions to the word.
Mm-hmm.
And the first thing I think is a problem is what is something like after the fact naming of resilience.
Okay.
That has a shadow side to it. Examples are very appropriately when coaches of teams that have gone through a difficult period, or the mayor of a city that went through a disaster, when they acknowledge that resilience has been shown by the team or the community, that's a positive acknowledgement. But the shadow side is that the resilience has been sort of done. And it's a good thing that the resilience was there. It doesn't have a forward-looking view towards what would resilience look like now, and what are we as leaders going to provide as support for it.
Mm-hmm.
Another way that after the fact resilience is a shadow side is when I was a medical student, one of our lecturers, a very prominent and erudite trauma specialist, Bruce Perry, he in his beginning lecture to us, which is about children and trauma, he said, children are not resilient. And he just paused for a moment. And then he went through how by saying that kids who have been neglected or abused, by focusing on their resilience, we are doing a lot of wishful thinking as adults that we really hope they're resilient. Look at that. They seem to be just fine. And that erases the exposures that these children have endured. So it's not that saying that people are resilient after the fact is in itself a problem. It sometimes just paints over other experiences that we could have.
Yes.
The other thing is that I think personal resilience is often encouraged when systems or institutions are a great part of fueling the hurt.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not ethical to ask people to learn how to cope with or tolerate entirely preventable suffering that's driven by policies, general practices, or leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And some of your listeners will recognize that in situations of racism, misogyny, bigotry, and oppression, asking the suffering community to somehow be resilient is just a way to sidestep the true source of the pain. And that's like blaming people for not having an umbrella when the weather is not being reported accurately, effectively, or truthfully.
Right. Wow.
Your question was, what do I think about the word resilience? I think resilience is only as valuable as it is useful. And so I've spent a lot of time distilling the elements of what it looks like to actually build resilience.
Mm-hmm.
The word resilience was way, way back. It started to be used to describe a property of timber and wood, to explain why some types of wood were able to accommodate sudden and severe loads and be functional afterwards.
Okay.
And my father, a structural engineer, all his life, he made calculations on resilience so that the structures that were consequential would be built to quality. They would be built to last through the things that they expected would be stresses towards it.
Right.
So I like the idea of a bridge, because bridges need to be built to hold. And what does it actually take to engineer this bridge? The materials, and the conditions it's going to be withstanding. And the idea of a bridge is, let's say an earthquake affects a bridge. Mm-hmm. That bridge may not be at 100% after the earthquake, but there's enough surge capacity, there's enough margin in the strength of the bridge that at 98%, it's still going to hold as reliably as it's intended to, that nobody will be hurt by using this bridge.
Right.
So I think we should engineer resilience in a certain way. I don't want to make it too mechanistic because there's a heart to it.
Yes.
But I do believe that instead of thinking about resilience as a trait that people have or don't have, or a state, you seem to be resilient, it's better to think about it as skills and competencies that are continually supported and practiced in order to be optimally in a place where we can thrive in adversity, because adversity is a given. We're going to have adversity in our life. It's just a matter of how supported we are and how skilled we are at responding to it.
Right. Wow. Thank you for that explanation. That aligns with a lot of the way I think about resiliency. You may have heard me describe it as I have a hate, not completely hate relationship with the word.
I like the way you talk about it. And I that's the top line, but I've heard you speak in detail about the ways in which it's problematic. And I appreciate that you can have a both and approach to this term and construct.
Yes. And I very much appreciate the way that you talk about it as well. I think I've been furiously taking notes as you've been speaking. I like some of the terms that you use. So thank you for that. I named the podcast Notes on Resilience, even knowing that it was not necessarily always my favorite word, but I think it is an important quality. And like, as you described it, skills and competencies, not necessarily a trait. So, in your experience and what you do, what do you think people most misunderstand about resilience, or maybe about trauma?
When it comes to what we misunderstand about resilience, is that people sometimes confuse it with grit, which is another well-described psychological construct. And with grit, there's a lot of focus on being able to weather adversity and succeed. And that is not exactly what resilience is about. Resilience is not only about the performance of a task. It's about what is left inside of that person or that team or that organization after all is said and done. Grit seems to be very focused on achievement of something, and something that we admire. I mean, grit could be in sports. It could be in our professional lives, in parenting. We need grit. But resilience has it's kind of a bi-directional arrow. It affects our life and what we're trying to do, but it also points back to us and just how much well-being we can have. I really like to think about a resilience that way. So I think it shouldn't be misunderstood as simply bouncing back or weathering adversity. That's an incomplete picture.
Yeah.
When misunderstanding about trauma, you must have heard a lot of this with your other guests, that trauma is not just PTSD or anxiety disorders or dissociative disorders. When we say trauma, we shouldn't be misunderstood to be talking about a disorder or a clinical condition. In my experience, the vast majority of perceivable trauma is subclinical. It's less than clinical trauma. That doesn't make it any less significant. I think of the dividing line as, if it's clinical trauma, then a clinician is the most evidence-based way to speed one's recovery, the most effective recovery.
Okay.
Subclinical trauma, clinicians can work with that as well, but also we have a lot of do-it-yourself evidence-based methods to deal with subclinical trauma. And I think it's really important for people to understand that while we do not want to paint the whole of society as everybody is traumatized,
right,
there is a way in which trauma touches most people in some proportion. I sometimes say, forgive the analogy, that if you have a bowl of penne pasta and you marinara sauce, none of the penne is going to escape without a little bit of marinara on it.
Yes.
So it's not the same amount and it's not the same magnitude of trauma for everybody, but we
Right.
should be very attentive to trauma that is truly, by trauma, I mean something that's related to an exposure of
Mhm.
high stress, high threat, that then leaves an impression on that person that isn't going away just spontaneously or with time.
Right. Right. I do like the penne pasta analogy. It's very helpful because, when I think about trauma, I think about my own experience, which was mass violence and, a thing that happened to me at this one instant.
Right.
And I know that is merely one kind of trauma and one kind of exposure. But you're right. Not everybody has been equally badly traumatized. That makes sense. But everybody's had something happen to them that is some form of trauma. Sometimes people refer to big T trauma and little T trauma.
Right. I've heard one of your guests say that.
Is that a phrase that you typically use?
My colleagues and I, we actually noodled around with that and we gave it some serious thought. And we actually started writing an article. The article just did not, it maintained a sort of a level of being dissatisfying to make these distinctions.
Okay.
I think it's really useful in the more clinical setting, in the relational setting. People can talk about the micro traumas that lead to something. Mm-hmm. Whenever we actually noticed something that would go in the column of little t trauma, it just wouldn't hang out there only. Sometimes it applied in the big T trauma. So I don't use it a whole lot, but I do appreciate that can help make some very important distinctions and that help us appreciate all the little ways, all the micro tears that occur in our lives that lead to traumatic symptoms or traumatic relationships.
Yes. I like that, micro tears. That's a nice way to think about it. I myself am very much someone who likes to categorize things. I like to kind of know where things fit. That helps me picture the world so I can see that is a way to help try to understand what's happening to individuals. But I think nobody likes to think about the fact that we all will be exposed in some way to some sort of trauma.
I can empathize with that. I can see that on one hand, it could be really overwhelming for people to think that everyone is traumatized. Mm-hmm. The second is that some people who work with very traumatized communities, mm-hmm. they want to reject the idea that we ourselves as helpers, healers, and protectors are traumatized because there's no, to make the equivalence is really anathema. And they just don't want to say, I mean, we may be stressed, but we're not traumatized.
Right.
And there again, I think it's about, is there something in your life? Is there a trauma that you encountered or that still affects you rather than going into the word, I am traumatized, which mm-hmm. sounds like there's a finality to it in a sense.
Yes.
I like to be rather open. I mean, you look at the symptoms of subclinical trauma, sleep disturbance and agitation, irritability, avoidance of certain reminders. All of these, even if I had just one of those many problems or symptoms, that one thing is a source of suffering for me.
Yes.
So I would really invite people who are thinking about how much are we applying this term or not, is it's a lens by which we can notice suffering and people who have been impacted by something that we can do something about. We actually have the tools and know-how to do something about it. So it almost to me seems like a responsibility to mm-hmm. name it, but name it proportionally without the overstating of it.
Right. And trauma is, as we were just talking about, it's a scary word. People don't want to think about it. They don't, even I know in my own circumstance, many people just don't want to address it and don't want to talk about it. I don't know. And sometimes I think it's for fear of not of hurting me, but of them experiencing discomfort from learning more about it.
I think you're right about that. Now, one of the unfortunate, tragic parts of trauma is that it stimulates avoidance reactions.
Yes.
And so that is, I mean, just like somebody with depression may know what might help their depression, but it's hard to get to do it.
Yes.
And having empathy for that is very important. It's not just that they're willing themselves not to do something about it. In the same way, trauma, I think by giving more voice to it, your podcast, your advocacy, it really helps to normalize it, mainstream it in ways that are empowering for society. I also believe that there is a very significant contingent of individuals and people who are now flipping that and not saying, instead of trauma being scary to mention, they're being very proactive about naming trauma. And I think larger systems and organizations should take heed to this, because the organization may want to avoid the mention of it because, it just seems like a big Pandora's box to open up, or it's going to cost a lot to deal with, or it's just very weighty. Why do we want to hang out in that energy? Can't we just be positive or look forward? But I think that with the democratization and mainstreaming of videos all online that we can watch, and people actually speaking about the traumatic exposures they have, it is changing. It's really helping this large ship in the water make a turn, so that it would almost seem peculiar to want to avoid the use of the word trauma eventually, because there's so much education around it and awareness and a sense of alarm.
Right. We've talked about throughout the conversation about the role of our institutions and our systems and our organizations. And what do you think is their role in helping people heal from trauma or in supporting resiliency?
Well, we reside in our networks. We are wired to be with people and in systems. So one of your guests, and I just like the whole the panel of guests that you've had, said that trauma is contextual. There's just no direct line from something to a traumatic reaction. There's so much context to it. And since trauma and resilience, for that matter, are contextual, a system or institution that neglects their role is leaving too much on the table, too many opportunities. And actually what's happening is that it's sapping the positive, productive energy from the system by not dealing with trauma. And so the opportunities to be proactive and to get positive results are not only better than ever, but staff and managers, as I said, can point to an online video or an article saying, hey, we know better than this. We know that we are working in the midst of trauma exposures and risk. And since we know what was once invisible, 30 years ago, this would not have been as acceptable and understood.
Right.
It's our responsibility with what we know now to select evidence-based methods to equip people and cope with the exposures they have to endure. I think organizations have for years done like the employee assistance program or meditation rooms or yoga classes, a lot of credit to people who invest appropriately in these interventions. However, all of these basically, they rely on somebody raising their hand and say, yeah, I'm the kind of person who does meditation. I'm the kind of person who goes to the EAP. You have to self-identify in general. Sometimes it's a manager encouraging it, but there's some labor relations laws also that tend to make sure that the manager doesn't somehow prescribe.
Right.
Right. So I think that this leaves a gap. And instead, what needs to happen is that for any organization that has populations, maybe it's the whole population, I believe, oftentimes that is at risk for trauma exposures, that there be universal prevention, mitigation, education. And this has at least two major benefits. One is the obvious. You teach people skills that they can apply when they need them. It's the competencies. You give them opportunities to practice something. It's not about just a tip sheet. I mean, anybody can get a tip sheet and a self-help book. And one person once quipped that if self-help books worked completely, then there only need to be one in the whole world. But we keep needing them because we need to keep being reminded. Yes. But an organization, by giving people an opportunity to just settle into the reality that there are traumatic realities, allows everybody to just be able to look at each other and say, oh yeah, we are kind of in the same boat here. Yeah. And that's important. So there's the skills building and that second piece, which is reduction of shame, blame, and stigma. By doing something universally within an organization, it makes it a job duty to be vigilant for trauma and what you can do about trauma.
Yes.
And I think that reduces the sense of, I don't want to be the one who says that I have concerns, I have some issues, some reactions.
Right.
If everybody at one point can say, yeah, we're all vulnerable and we're all in this together, that social cohesion makes a big difference. And shame, blame, and stigma really sap energy from otherwise healthy organizations.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, thank you for that. I appreciate that insight. And what is one important lesson about resilience that you've learned because of your work?
Well, I want to thank the people that I've been able to just be close to, because they have taught me an enormous amount. What I've learned is that people generally have strong and kind intentions, but when they aren't methodical and studied about the situation, they guess, they improvise, they avoid.
Mm-hmm.
One story that might give a sense of what I've learned is that when the island nation of Sri Lanka experienced the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004,
Yes.
I went to visit different organizations and look at the psychiatric response and the informal sector's response.
Yes.
And not only I, but people have written about this afterwards. We noticed that there are many very well-intentioned humanitarian aid providers that had come into Sri Lanka to provide aid.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes these aid workers had not consulted the community healers and the community practices that have been used for generations to heal from a community that has known trauma before that.
Mm-hmm.
And I directly noticed that there was this one shelter where there was a desk with two psychiatry interns, two young psychiatry interns. And when I went into the shelter, their desk was empty. And there was a line formed to my friend Ranjan. Ranjan is a healer who does practices that have no name to them, but he just has a way of holding people at different pressure points, and people feel considerably better afterwards, subjectively at least. And that line was long. He hardly got to take a break because word of mouth got out after people had the treatment.
Right.
It would be like saying, I experienced like a burden had been lifted off of me. I'm still grieving, but there's something different.
Right.
And so I think what I've learned is to want to pay attention as much as possible, to listen to some of the voices that might be marginalized, that have oftentimes the most important information and are holding the pathway to more freedom and health.
Yeah. Wow. That paints such a clear picture of that cultural sensitivity. And I've read other pieces about that particular response and the struggle with not being culturally sensitive to how people chose to heal, wanted to heal.
Yes. Cultural sensitivity it's definitely not a on-off switch. It's a continual practice. All these years that, in the United States, we've talked about cultural sensitivity or cultural competence. I really appreciate it when we have the mindset that cultural diversity or cultural opportunity, that they are opportunities, not problems to be solved. Mm-hmm. That really, you don't want to leave those opportunities on the table and have missed the chance to have a greater bond and greater effectiveness with whomever we're working with. That's the point after all, anyways.
Right. Right. The point is to help the people that we're working with.
Yeah.
And that isn't always the way that I or someone else might think is the way to help them. So we're getting close to the end, and I want to ask, what's one question that you wish I had asked you, and how would you have answered it?
Right. I would say, I'm glad that you're editing this, because one question I'd wish you'd ask. Oh, I know that you're really also deeply tied and interested in the idea of compassion. So a question around compassion. What I would say about compassion is that it's not merely a feeling. It is an actual stimulus to want to do something about suffering. Mm-hmm. And I think that compassion, organization that I started, Greenleaf Integrative, is hopefully always trying to make compassion more real and felt. That it is an attentiveness towards suffering and attentiveness towards trauma and how we can respond as citizens, as peers, as family members. And I believe that compassion is a place of strength. It is exactly what people want from each other. And so I would hope that nothing blocks or dams up compassion.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Speaking of compassion, what would you tell your 18-year-old self about either compassion or resiliency?
Well, about resilience, I would urge my 18-year-old self to remember hope and action in finding trusted others to support me. So let me just say that again, a different way. I think I was mostly a private person in my teenage years, but I had no shortage of teenage heartbreak and living life in an unsustainably busy way with little sleep.
Yes.
But I was very private about it. And I think that when we actually find the right people that we can speak to, that hope and that sense of action of being in things together really would have been excellent for my 18-year-old self.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, thank you. So this is the end of our conversation, at least the part that we're recording for the podcast. So thank you so much for being here. Tell us, how can our listeners reach you?
Well, Greenleaf Integrative has a website and several one-pagers and tools. So for anybody who wants to know, well, what do I do with this information?
Yeah.
Please visit. So our URL is greenleafintegrative.com, greenleafintegrative.com. So it's integrative, like integrative medicine. And the way to contact us would be, so we actually do regularly check our info at inbox. We care deeply what people are sending us. So info at greenleafintegrative.com would do the trick.
Great.
I think that, on our website, the resources tab has coping tools. You can download articles that we've written or we love. There are case studies in one article, and perhaps the most popular tool of all is our check-in card with an easy visual on how well or not well we are, and then what degree of intervention one should consider.
Yeah.
And I'm always ready to provide a live experience of these tools. A bunch of the meditations that I've recorded on coping with stress are there for sort of workplace environment, but they're pretty broadly applicable outside the workplace as well.
Yeah. And speaking of meditation, didn't we talk about you giving us a meditation for my podcast listeners? Is that something you're still able to do?
I'm all set.
All right. So listeners, this is a special treat. I'm now going to turn it over to you, Siddharth, to lead us in a meditation.
Okay. Well, in one way or the other, our lives require awareness and vigilance. With too much vigilance, we become rigid and brittle. With too little vigilance, we become sloppy and mistakes occur. We all perform better when our senses are operating properly. Whatever the conditions of your external environment, your senses are always active, sending information to your brain. In order to optimize your receptivity and your situational awareness, we can practice choosing the quality and object of your awareness. Let's start with our eyes open at this point. Slowly look around at your surroundings. Notice what is behind you. Notice what is above you. Notice everything you want in your environment. Notice how you have control in directing your sight, how it is an asset to your awareness. At this point, if you're someone who likes having their eyes closed for meditations, you may do so now. Carefully listen to your surroundings. Notice what you can hear nearby. Notice what you can hear far away. Notice how you can direct your sense of hearing and how it is an asset to your awareness. Gently bring your attention to your sense of touch now. Maybe start with the feeling of fabric on your body. Feel the weight of your arms. Notice the energy all over your skin that allows awareness throughout. Notice the pleasant sensations especially. Small shifts in our sense of touch can give us important clues to what is happening to us. Finally, I invite you to notice muscle tension and our ability to bring calm and ease to ourselves. Let's go to the shoulders. Tighten your shoulders by raising them up as if you're going to touch your ears. Hold. Notice if you're holding your breath. Your breath can flow in and out freely as you hold your shoulders up. And now release your shoulders. Let's do that one more time, knowing at the outset that you should keep breathing while tensing your muscles. Tighten your shoulders by raising them up as if you were going to touch your ears. Hold. Keep breathing. And then release. Enjoy the feeling of release throughout your upper arms and back. Your senses, along with your brain and other parts of your nervous system, are what keep you feeling alive and in tune with your environment. As you close this practice session, notice how you shift into your next task, your next experience. Notice how effortlessly you can direct your awareness. If you decided to close your eyes earlier, gently bring your eyes to open and adjust to the environment. That concludes this short practice session.
Wow. Thank you. And our listeners, thank you.
I enjoy being able to have an experience. I did a lot of talking, a lot of yapping, but there's just something about us all participating and doing something together.
Yes, absolutely lovely. And I know our listeners are going to enjoy it as well. So thank you again, Siddharth, for your time today. Bye-bye.
Absolutely. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for listening. I hope you got as much out of this conversation as I did. So if you'd like to learn more about me, Manya Chilinsky, I work with organizations to help understand how to create environments where people can thrive after difficult life experiences. And I do this through talks and consulting. I'm a survivor of mass violence, and I use my experience to help leaders learn about resiliency, compassion, and trauma-sensitive leadership, to build strategies to enable teams to thrive and be engaged amidst difficulty and turmoil. If this is something you want to learn more about, visit my website, www.manyachilinsky.com, or email me at manya@manyachilinsky, or stop by my social media on LinkedIn and Twitter. Thanks so much.